So it's delightful to be here. I'm really grateful to be asked to speak to you tonight. And it's lovely to see all of your faces and to also see my lovely friend Samachita as well. So the title of my talk um, is Losing and Finding Ourselves in the Service of Others. So I'm really grateful to have been asked to give the talk, because giving talks is one of the ways that I can give of myself. And obviously that's partly what I want to talk about tonight. So I know that you have a bit of a theme of perfect emotion running, and I guess my talk is fundamentally underpinned by, I guess, the principle that what we choose to do with our emotional response to the world fundamentally affects our participation in it. So I'd like to dive a bit deeper into the altruistic dimension of practice, for which we need both tons of energy and tons of positive emotion. So a bodhisattva, so that's one who has dedicated their life to the benefit of all beings, will certainly have lots of positive emotion, without which we can do very little. It's really hard to make any kind of progress in the spiritual life if we lack both energy and positivity. And I don't know about you, but for many of us in this culture, there are lots of things that make that hard for us. That can be a lack of self-worth, the pull of consumerism, and not really being able to value what we could offer to this world. I think many people suffer with the question of why bother? Why bother to practice at all? And I think that by practicing an offering of ourselves, like making ourselves an offering, we are making a huge proclamation that we have to bother. We have to bother with ourselves, with each other, and with this precious, beautiful world. But each one of us does need to ask that question. I think it's really important. And when I was writing this talk, I realized that I wanted to say more about why I bother, and why I think that being of service in this world is an opportunity to both lose ourselves and to find ourselves. That's definitely what my experience has been. So I'd like to start with a quote from the Ratnaguna Samchayagatha. It's one of my favorite quotes. So call forth as much as you can of love, of respect, and of faith. Remove the obstructing defilements and clear away all your taints. Listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas, taught for the weal of the world, for heroic spirits intended. And I wanted to start with that quote because it completely encapsulates my aspiration for what I would like to do more and more of in my practice. And hopefully the talk will draw out all the components of that quote, but I wanted to say the first line again and to start with that first line. So call forth as much as you can of love, of respect, and of faith. That's an invocation to us. So in talking about how I practice and why I practice, I need to talk about why I bother to practice. And of course, for each of us, if we're asking ourselves that question, there will be a different response, depending, I would suggest, on both our internal and our external conditions. But, also on where we came from, on our childhood conditioning and what we struggle with on a day-to-day basis. So for me to answer the question of why bother, I need to say a bit more about where I come from and how that shaped me. So I was brought up in London, and I spent the first 10 years of my life living in a pub just by Big Ben. So St James's Park was our back garden, and my sister and I spent many hours there with our dogs, running fairly wild, I have to say. We had quite a tough time growing up. My parents were very young when they had us, and they were just simply unable to be parents. There was a lot of alcohol and drug abuse and a lot of violence. It was chaotic and it was scary a lot of the time, and we were very neglected. When your parents are both alcoholics, you really learn to look after yourself, and you learn to stay out of the way when the violence starts. And my sister and I, we weren't looked after at all. We were very much that family. And I think something that was really painful was that everyone knew what was going on. Everyone in the neighbourhood knew, but this was, the 1970s, and child protection was a very different beast then. But we were very lucky because we had our grandparents, my beloved nan and granddad, who we'd be able to stay with occasionally. And they gave us a sense of normality and care. And I think that having that contrast was so important because it made me realize that there wasn't anything wrong with me, but there was something wrong with my mum and dad. And that viewpoint has stood me in really good stead over the years. Not in a blaming way at all, not that, not a sense of them being wrong, not blaming them, but because the extent to which I felt I was at fault because we were so physically and psychologically abused was really limited. I just knew some they were never going to be okay as parents. So I withdrew my expectation that it could be any different. And I also learnt, in a way, to be my own refuge. I now have a really rich inner life and I can survive on very little external support or input. And that capacity to be self-reliant was forged in that environment. And I'm really now able to draw a lot on those inner riches. But that wasn't always the case. Um, I think it's impossible to climb out of so much horror and violence and not be affected and not have that experience shape one's view of oneself and the world. So I did survive all of that. But in my early 20s, I was really a very lost young woman. I was like a leaf being blown in the wind, a pinball bouncing from one reactive situation to another without any real sense that I was going to be okay. And I think it's important to make the distinction between surviving and thriving. And at that point in my life, I had only just survived. When I last saw my parents together, it's 31 years ago, they assaulted me and they left me in the street. I had nowhere to live, no belongings on me, and nowhere to go. And I remember a taxi driver pulled up and he picked me up off the ground and he said, I'm going to call the police. And I told him that they were my parents. And he simply said, I'll take you anywhere, sweetheart, no charge at all. And what I remember most about the incident was the kindness of that taxi driver, the shock on his face when I told him that the people he'd witnessed assaulting me were my parents. And it was an affirmation of my humanity and the fact that it wasn't okay to be treated like that. And 8 weeks after that incident, I walked into the West London Buddhist Centre. Now, I believe that my parents and their lifestyle had to depart my life before the Dharma could come into my life. For me, those two incidents are intimately connected. I could not call forth in respect or faith while I was in a situation where people treated me as less than human. And so often it happens like that. My experiences, our choices absolutely define us and they set up entrain a stream of events that are kind of unforeseen and unimaginable. So when I got up off the pavement that night, I heard within me for the first time really a clear voice saying that I was done, that I would never allow anyone to treat me like that again. And that voice of self-respect was the seed of my spiritual path. That's what enabled me to walk into the West London Buddhist Centre and to start to seek the truth. And I don't think I could have recognised what was being offered to me without that seed. But I also think that I was someone who was really lucky because for me, the answer to the question, why bother, was firmly rooted in the experience of what life could be like. In some ways, if your conditions are really positive, you have a good life, you feel okay about yourself, then I guess I imagine it might be harder to value the immense treasures of what the three jewels have to offer, or rather it might take more imagination. For me, I was in hell and the three jewels were the way out of that hell. It was really straightforward. The Dharma really was medicine to me. And I had to bother and summon the energy and the will, otherwise I knew my life was going to be a car wreck. It took me a long time to recover from what happened to me for the first 22 years of my life. I'd been in a combat zone for so long and I was reeling from that for a really long time. Galway Kinnell puts it beautifully when he says, the bud stands for all things, even for those things that don't flower, for everything flowers from within of self-blessing. Though sometimes it is necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness, to put a hand on the brow of the flower and retell it in words and in touch that it is lovely until it flowers again from within of self-blessing. And I had no sense at all of my loveliness, and I needed to learn it to be retaught it. And my experience was that the unlearning of brutality and the learning of self value were the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I had no idea who I was, where I was going, or whether or not I really had any place in this world. I was completely alone for a long time, and all that really kept me going was my work and my contact with Triratna and the structure and friendships I found in Triratna. Inside, I was quite shut down, really, but I was also full of potential and longing. And practicing the Dharma woke me up. It gave me a path into my own heart and a way to invoke my own sense of love, respect, and faith. And, there was definitely a point in my early days of involvement with Triratna when I realized I was faced with a clear choice. I felt like I literally had to dig myself up. And I recall very clearly thinking, well, I can live on very little. I can survive like this. I can just get through life. I'll just get by. So why bother going through all the pain of kind of opening myself up? For me, this was my why bother moment. And I realized that it wasn't straightforward at all, and that to my horror, if I didn't practice the Dharma and get some therapy and sort my life out, then the chances were that I might actually repeat all the terrible patterns of my childhood. My nightmare scenario was that I would live it all again in the choices I would make in my own life. And for me, that would have been a living death. What the Dharma offered me was something I had longed for my entire life. It offered me the freedom to choose, the freedom to be whatever I wanted to be, to redefine myself, to hold myself lightly and fluidly, and to give my life to something bigger than me and my wretched family. So I called forth as much as I could of love and respect and faith. And I've spent the next 30 years starting the job of removing the obstructing defilements. And what I mean by that is that we do not all start in the same place. And the focus of our practice is as unique as we are, but it's making the effort that matters. It's practicing that matters. It's all there is. No end, no goal. Just the daily practice of trying to live in your own head, working with your tendencies, trying to be the best human being you can be, and offering yourself like a jewel to this impoverished world. I think it's really easy to get caught up in comparisons, like, oh, they're further along the path than me, they've got more friends than me, they know more Dharma than me, they're going to get ordained before me, and on it goes. Well, let me tell you, it took me nearly 22 years to join the order, and in some ways, I needed every single one of those years. I didn't always choose wisely in that 22 years, and I had some very painful experiences. But in the final analysis, they were all my choices, and I can see that I had something to learn from every single one of those experiences. And I have never felt like a victim, not as a child or a young woman, and not in my protracted ordination process, and not as a result of the spinal injury I suffered 5 years ago. I think that not feeling like a victim has been the greatest freedom for me. I still get to choose the story I write and I tell about myself. And the story is that it took me a long time to join the order, and I didn't waste any one of the joyful and painful experiences I had. I've learned a lot and I've received a lot. So, what Triratna offered me in the 22 years I was in the ordination process was a context and continuity. It gave me access to the Dharma, which in turn helped me understand my conditioning, my patterns, and my tendencies, and also to unlock my potential. It introduced me to people who became my friends, some of whom, along with my husband and our dogs, are the great loves of my life. I was able to make mistakes within the context of a Sangha that was never going to reject me as long as I was able to stay on the path. There came a point a few years ago when I realized that the Sangha wasn't going to expel me. And then I knew that in the truest sense of the word, I'd come home. And it's on the basis of feeling safe enough to do the work on oneself that one gets to become a happier human being, more at peace with oneself, and therefore with more to give the world. And that's how I practice. So the process of removing our defilements then becomes the work of lifetimes. And I'm not sitting here now telling you that I've cracked that in any way at all. But I want to explain a bit more in practical terms how I use the Dharma on a day-to-day basis and what that now means for me. So doing things to help and support others in the world is something we can all do, even in the smallest and humblest of ways. And for me, my work has been how I express my going for refuge. You know, in addition to the altruistic dimension, we have to work on our minds through Dharma study. And one of the most profound teachings for me is the three lakshanas, the three marks of how things are, which is suffering, impermanence, and insubstantiality. But in terms of how I practice, this is where I live. And I specifically want to talk about meeting that lakshana of suffering because it's a cornerstone of my practice. My own early life meant that I knew a lot about suffering, and I needed to find a way of understanding how to make sense of the suffering I'd experienced and witnessed. I needed a framework and a way of practically applying myself to the problem of human suffering. And this is how I found an outlet. I found a vocation. So in my work, I'm head of public protection for the National Probation Service, and I deal with suffering on a daily basis. So a little bit of background. I've been working for the probation service since 1991, and I started at the entry level, and I've worked my way up through most of the roles from probation assistant to probation officer, now into senior leader. And in my current role as head of public protection, I hold responsibility for all sexual and violent offendings, all critical incidents, including child death reviews, homicide reviews, terrorism, extremism, safeguarding, and domestic abuse. And I'm also the UK lead for serious further offending. So fortunately, I have a large team who work round the clock doing extraordinary work every day with some of the most challenging material imaginable and with some of the most traumatized and dangerous people in our community. So in the course of the last 32 years, I guess I've spent 30 of them involved with Triratna and 22 training for ordination. Apart from a wonderful spell in 1995 when I had the great good fortune to work with Lokapala and my sporadic contact with Vishvapani over the last 3 years, I've spent the entire period of my working life working alongside non-Buddhists and being an open Buddhist in my own workplace. So what can I say about the work? Well, it is visceral and it challenges you on every level. In my experience, human beings don't cope well with dissonance, and we have an innate desire to push away what is ugly and painful. And the work that I do is all about dissonance and complexity. I see the pattern of sanskaras repeating in people's lives and the tragedy of that moment when someone realizes they've become everything they most dreaded. I see the effect of acts that can seemingly never be redeemed, and the reality that some things are simply too terrible to bear, but people still walk around every day bearing them. I sit with parents whose children have been killed by someone we had responsibility to supervise, and I sit in the turmoil of all that blame, anger, and loss, and I see my staff having to do all of that too every day. I say now that there is nothing I could hear that could surprise me, that I have seen and heard things that could not be imagined by most people, that should not be imagined by most people. So this work is in so many ways a true hell realm. It's the apotheosis of the poisons, the worst that can be done by human beings to themselves and others. So that's the descriptor of what we do, but that is not at all the story I want to tell you. In the 31 years I've been doing this work, I have indeed seen the worst, but I've also seen the best. I have been floored by unimaginable acts of truth and beauty and moments of true humanity. The work that we do is an extraordinary privilege. It is an honor to step into the maelstrom of someone's life and stand beside them and hold both their horror and their beauty and refuse to believe even for one moment that the darkness is stronger than the light. It is a deep honor to sit with parents who will never recover from the murder of their child and witness their pain and rage at how things are. So many of the men and women with whom I work may never find anything even approximating peace or forgiveness or redemption in this lifetime. Most of them will not make it. Life will defeat them. The forces of their own samskaras and conditions will smash them to pieces and overwhelm them, have already overwhelmed them. And sometimes the forces of samskaras are simply too strong, and people just don't have the conditions to break free in this life. I've seen this over and over again. So you may well ask me, what is the point? Why bother to make any effort in that realm at all? So Chogyam Trungpa, whose writing I love, he's a modern Buddhist teacher. He describes the essence of warriorship as never giving up on anyone or anything. And that has always been my practice, will always be my practice. I will never give up on anyone. And our role in probation is to meet all of that suffering head on. Our role is to hold the hope that any act of kindness and metta has an effect, and that the way we treat people we work with is in itself a revolutionary act. You know, I cannot tell you how many funerals I've attended where the probation officer was the only person there. How many lifers come out of prison after 20 years with literally nothing and no one. So when we engage with people in an honest, open, and kindly way, it's very often met with suspicion and surprise. Some people can't accept it. You know, their view of themselves is too toxic. They've been let down by so many professionals and people in their lives that we will never win their trust. But the point of the work is that we never cease to try. I've seen over and over again that metta is revolutionary in our environment. You know, just a tiny bit of kindness is like a beacon in the night. And it takes so little to change people's perception of themselves simply by treating them kindly. I've seen over and over again the expectation of judgment and revulsion being met with acceptance and metta, and how that's revelatory. So, this is what we can do when we place our energy and our lives at the service of others. The Dharma showers us with gifts that can bless this world. And being able to give of ourselves is such a freedom. You know, I have completely lost myself in this work in the best and most beautiful way. So, you know, we live in a culture that's very focused on instant gratification. Well, in my world, the most you can hope is that you never see someone again, that they never come back because they might have just made it. You know, we play the long game, and it's an incredible practice to consistently engage with material and individuals that's that demanding and challenging with so few rewards. We simply have to dig deep and rely on a deep faith that offering kindness, honesty, and hope cannot fail. So I work with non Buddhists, but I do not work without the Dharma. And I would suggest that the work we do is predicated on the notion that we must be and exemplify the alternative. In an essence, we must be the Buddha, even if that's not at all in your vocabulary. So, as a senior leader, my job is to hold the center of all of that storm for my staff. I have to be unshakable in the face of that material, whilst not for one moment pretending that I'm not moved. I've unashamedly wept in front of my staff at some of the stories we've heard, and I think it's so important as a leader to show that humanity. Indeed, I would suggest that my ability to hold the center of the storm directly relates to being able to locate my heart and speak from it when required. You know, leadership in this environment is not in any way about being tough or hard or unmoved. And in some ways, that would be the worst thing I could possibly do. My role is to treat my team with as much love and compassion as I can muster so that they can do that for the client group. I need to be able to model adult to adult conversations so that they can do that too. I need to be a big enough container for their grief and distress and anger at the material so that they don't become brittle and hardened to it. And in some ways, the biggest challenge of the work is to simply keep one's heart open. And my role is also to teach them how to hold the complexity and not oscillate between blame and denial, to hold on to the belief that none of us should ever be defined by the worst thing that we've done. And my role is also to try and exemplify the appropriate use of power. It would be really easy to go for refuge to the kudos status and power I hold. And of course, it would be completely disastrous, which is not to say that I don't have to actively work with that tendency to identify with what I do rather than just being Amaladipa. I'm trusted with the power and responsibility to send people back to prison, which I frequently do. I'm faced on a weekly basis with a choice between returning someone to prison and realizing they may kill themselves, or leaving them in the community where they may kill someone else. And I know from experience that there is something worse than the misuse of power, and it's the reluctance to use power for the good. Sometimes we have to save people from themselves, and we have to use whatever power and means we have to create external controls to help people manage their behavior. And we have to do so whilst knowing that we have no real idea if that's the right choice at all. All we've got is our motivation. So that's why it's critical that I have people around me who can tell me if I'm going down the rabbit hole. If I get out of control, or I back away from tough decisions, or I make the work all about me and my ego, then it's doomed. And all the work will reflect is my ego and confusion. And the work, most of all, is an expression of interconnection and going for refuge. It's an opportunity to serve. It's an act of renunciation, and it will carry on long after we have gone. So we do what we can, while we can, with as much of a spirit of going forth from our own ego clinging as we can muster on any given day. And of course, we fail, and we correct and apologize, and we try again. And that's the exemplification. That's the practice. There's a picture that sat in my office for years. You may be familiar with it, but I think it speaks directly to the work. So it depicts the Buddha Amitabha, and he's on the verge of enlightenment. He's about to enter nirvana, and he pauses and he looks back. He looks back over his shoulder at all beings suffering in samsara. And that moment of pause, that moment of looking back, for me, that's the reflex of the Bodhisattva, the refusal, the complete inability to leave any being behind. And that's what we do. We refuse to abandon them, and we refuse to abandon ourselves. So although I say I work with non-Buddhists, I see the Dharma and I see Vajrasattva everywhere. And these are my people. I will not reject any being, no matter what they've done. They're my people, my tribe, my Sangha. So this is how I practice. And of course, that requires a certain valor. We have to be brave in the face of all of that, which is why the verses talk about the Dharma being for heroic spirits intended. It says, listen to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas, taught for the weal of the world. In so many ways, all of us in this room right now are sitting on a gold mine. From the darkness of my childhood to the darkness and worst kind of human misery I see in my work, to the shock of having experienced my spinal injury, what I can tell you is I've learned two very important things. Firstly, that we are all in this together. We all feel the same pain, the same longing for freedom, the same shock and despair at the things that life throws at us. And the second thing I've learned is that there is a way out of it all, and that is the gold mine that we're sitting on. Sometimes we stumble on the very thing that gives our life structure and meaning, and sometimes we can recognize it and choose it. Either way, I want to suggest that a life really well lived has to have some dimension of service to others. Stumbling into the West London Buddhist Centre 31 years ago, unbeknown to me, I'd actually found the elixir of life, the inexhaustible treasure, the supreme medicine, a way to really be in this world and a way to really serve this world. So I listened to the perfect wisdom of the gentle Buddhas, and every day I try to be heroic. My daily prayer is, as long as space abides, and as long as the world abides, so long may I abide, dispelling the sufferings of the world. Thank you.